awarded the Asia Society's Humanitarian Services Award in recognition of her role in preventing violence against women and mainstreaming women's empowerment and employment in Bangladesh. As we discussed yesterday, the Dhaka Global Dialogue places the SDGs and development at the core of its agenda, and a women-first approach is certainly something that we aspire towards. There's no better speaker than the Honorable Dr. Shirin Sharmin Chaudhury, MP, to speak to us this afternoon. Ma'am, may I request you to take the floor? Thank you.
Good afternoon. Shubhamodhanno. It's a great honor and a very special privilege for me to join the Dhaka Global Dialogue this afternoon and to be in the midst of such an august gathering. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, participants, guests, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. I have been allocated about 20 minutes to talk about honing legislative innovation and parliamentary diplomacy and its future. Being the Speaker of the Bangladesh Parliament, parliamentary democracy in Bangladesh and the role of the Parliament globally, as we generally understand, Parliament is one of the organs of the state, along with the judiciary and executive, and the general concept about the work of the Parliament is that it is the legislature which is entrusted with the work of promulgating the laws and basically legislating. The other main function of the Parliament is deemed to be ensuring the accountability and transparency of the government, and at the same time, passing the budget, allocation of the resources, and approving that is also one of the major functions of the Parliament in the very conventional and traditional form and setup. But now we are faced with a new dimension of the role of parliaments in the global and international scenario, and this concept is commonly known as parliamentary diplomacy, which is also termed in some cases as international parliamentarianism. Now, this is a concept which is flourishing in the global stage. It is gaining momentum, and rightly so. It is therefore very relevant, and I thank the organizers, BISS, ORF, and the Foreign Ministry of Bangladesh and others for including such an interesting topic in one of the sessions of Dhaka Global Dialogue. The changing pace of globalization creates new order of emerging economies, technology, and development. If we look all around us, and if we look around the world today, we see it poses critical challenges of refugee and migration issue, forcibly displaced people, and a burning example is the Rohingya issue in Bangladesh, human trafficking, terrorism, displacement of people due to climate change adverse effects, climate refugees, conflict, etc. All these issues transcend national boundaries. It is in this backdrop that parliaments cannot merely confine its role as a national institution. The impact of globalization has its ramification on democracy. Democracy must deliver and meet the challenges of poverty eradication, inequality, food security, and all the other common agendas that affect the lives of the people. Trends of these challenges that we face as nations are more global than national. In some cases, we are not even all equally responsible for the emerging changes that take place. For instance, the climate change issue, where the global warming is an aspect for which many countries are now subjected and are identified as most vulnerable countries, MVC, as Bangladesh is one of them, but may not be equally responsible for the greenhouse gas emission. Yet, trends of these challenges that we face as nations are more global than national. Parliamentarians, as people's representatives, have to deal with these challenges posed by evolving new order. Parliamentarians are people's representatives. Parliaments are premier representative institutions, and parliamentarians are primarily responsible to fulfill the desires and expectations, and also have the responsibility to ensure the welfare of the people they serve. Greater voice of the people must be echoed, and their representation must be ensured in the multilateral decision-making processes that impact and affect our lives in enormous ways. Parliaments must be equipped to respond to these challenges to bring about positive difference in the lives of the people we serve. This is what makes parliamentarianism and parliamentary diplomacy so important and relevant, and brings it to the center stage of discourse. We cannot remain oblivious to the multi-layered diplomacy that is developing all around us. Parliaments today, if they notice, they play a major part in this multi-layered diplomacy process within and outside their own countries. The Inter-Parliamentary Union, the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, the PUIC, Parliamentary Union of OIC countries, and many more such platforms are actively engaging in ensuring the welfare of the people through the different state parliaments that are members of these forums and platforms. Parliamentary diplomacy at all different layers, be it bilateral, regional, international, multilateral framework, proves to be effective and instrumental in resolving complex issues through dialogue and peaceful negotiation. Increased exchange and interaction between parliaments help forge diplomatic ties and create consensus in less formal settings. Parliamentary friendship groups are effective tools in opening up new avenues to resolve issues and is complementary to government initiatives. As I mentioned, IPU, CPA, PUIC, and many other such platforms create the scope for parliamentary diplomacy. Thomas M. Frank, in his article, one of his articles mentioned, and I quote, "Democracy is becoming a global entitlement that collective international processes will increasingly promote and protect," unquote. So parliaments have to actually recognize this new role that it has of parliamentary diplomacy. Parliaments as partners for change has a shared responsibility with other organs of the state to lead the way forward. Now, one of the definitions among many of parliamentary diplomacy that I picked, I would share with you, is given by Thomas Gomenes in June 11, 2018, in one of his writings called Parliamentary Diplomacy as Track 1.5 Diplomacy in Conflict Resolution. And he describes parliamentary diplomacy as parliamentary diplomacy has been defined as the full range of international activities undertaken by parliamentarians in order to increase mutual understanding between countries to assist each other in improving the control of government and the representation of a people, and to increase the democratic legitimacy of intergovernmental institutions, unquote. Another definition goes on to say, parliamentary diplomacy is the means by which two or more parliaments conduct an ongoing dialogue with regard to key issues of common interest. It can be constitutional issues or other developmental issues. It also refers to negotiations and discussions carried out according to rules of procedure in international organizations. Now, various different activities have been brought within the periphery of parliamentary diplomacy. One, institutionalized or informal ways through which national parliaments and their members are engaged in international affairs and foreign policy matters. Two, bilateral relations through parliamentary friendship groups, exchange of delegations between parliaments. Three, relations between national parliaments and inter-parliamentary organizations. So they are laying out three different ways how parliamentary diplomacy can take place. And once again, it brings us back to the fact that globalization does contribute to the process of parliamentary diplomacy, because in a globalized world, things change in many aspects. Role of supranational bodies, be it at the regional level or international level, contributes to multiplicity of decisional levels. So there is a role for parliamentarians in that arena. One example, the massive migration that we see, a present trend, common trend in the world. On the one hand, national laws are affecting large group of people who are not nationals or citizens. But this is a reality of time. And this is what links us to the other half of the topic of today's discussion. Once I set the tone of what we mean by parliamentary diplomacy, how it works, and how this concept is developing very fast, I want to link it with honing legislative innovation. Honing legislative innovation is therefore of immense importance, because I mentioned that with one example, that with massive migration and people moving from one country to the other, that the country to which they are migrating, they are subject to the laws, the national laws, the domestic laws, and also governed by the international laws. And sometimes they are not even nationals of that country, but they are being governed by those laws. So honing legislative innovation becomes important in dealing with these critical issues. Multilateral activities are at the core of parliamentary diplomacy. Parliamentary diplomacy is more an institutionalized way than mere parliamentary cooperation. So there is a distinction. There can be parliamentary cooperation, but we may not essentially call it parliamentary diplomacy. So when we call it as parliamentary diplomacy, it is more in an institutionalized form. What gives rise to such parliamentary diplomacy? Proliferation of the international organizations, rise in regional integration, globalization, democratization, and trans-governmentalism. These are issues which create the fora for parliaments to engage in this diplomacy. It is important to set an environment for innovation, to allow exchanges of ideas, information, expertise, and competence. And this is also necessary for the legislators who are promulgating laws which will deal with issues not only within their own country, but also beyond the national boundaries. When we talk about innovation, legislative innovation, let us just very simply go through one or two definitions of what we mean by innovation. Granier and Renda in 2012 defines innovation in a very simple way and goes on to say, innovation is the creation of something new that contributes to progress. Then there is a slightly longer definition which elaborates it. A new thing or product can be considered innovation only to the extent it contributes to social welfare. So we see a moral dimension brought in here. It has to contribute to social welfare in the long run, without depriving society of resources that could have been more usefully allocated elsewhere. So that is another way of looking at innovation. Now, when we link innovation with legislation, I want to share three sets of examples with you. One is it can be country-based, in the sense that maybe in one particular country there is a budget constraint, or there is lack of resources to run public parks. So the budget necessitates closing down the large number of public parks. In such a situation, there can be an innovative legislation to allow private sectors to come in to run some of the parks. It may be communities, it may be societies, it may be voluntarily done, but this provision can be made in law to allow space for the private sector to maintain the parks and take it out of the domain of the government as there is resource constraint. So if the legislation provides this innovative way, then we can maybe save some of the parks and we may not need to shut down all of them. So this is just one example. So there are many such country-based legislative efforts around the world which deals with health issues, education, environment, by forging these innovative pieces of legislation. The other concept of innovative legislation is that legislation must be designed in a way that allows best possible conditions for innovation to flourish. So there must be sensitivity among the lawmakers to embrace the idea of innovation and not just have a stereotype, rigid approach. Certain laws can be more innovative and can be enhancing innovation, as opposed to certain laws that are prone to reduce incentives to innovation. So the lawmakers need to distinguish which one they want to adopt. Are they interested in promulgating legislations which will enhance innovation, or should they be inclined to making laws which reduce incentives to innovation? I think lawmakers will choose the first option, and they will make an effort to ensure that they are promoting and enhancing innovation through legislating. Law does therefore have the potential to be a powerful stimulus to innovation, and we cannot be oblivious to this fact. We must take account of this fact. For example, if we are passing a law which is energy efficient, promoting energy efficiency, then we will need to induct some provisions in that piece of legislation, for example, to show that household appliances which take or consume less energy or less electricity, like air conditioning, refrigerator, iron that we use, if we want to promote these goods, then we can put in the law a provision to give a color label or mark on these products when they are out in the market for sale, so that the customer can select that as a green product. So if the law is sensitive and innovative enough to add the green product mark on the energy efficient appliances, then it will promote the sale of these green product and these energy efficient products by reducing, and it will contribute ultimately it will contribute in reducing the energy consumption. The color labels can work as incentives for customers to buy greener products, incentive for producers and suppliers to innovate and meet demands for greener products, save and reduce the energy. It will enhance the energy security, thereby promote the climate strategy to cut greenhouse gas emission. So, by making small innovations within a legislation, we can actually contribute to greater causes and greater goods. And this can also be done not only in energy saving, but water saving or many other issues with which the lawmakers are dealing all the time. The other way of dealing with this is with the taxation laws. When we are imposing taxation, we can be more environment friendly, more energy friendly, and make provisions so that more incentive is given to these green products, for example, and as opposed to others, which will promote using of these products more. And the third aspect of the lawmaking process, which can be innovative, is at the multilateral lawmaking process, where we are engaging all the time. And this multilateral lawmaking process is adopted to deal with issues of multilateral negotiation. This opens up an arena of innovation in legislating. One of the current and relevant example is the Paris Agreement. This is the first agreement on climate change which enabled the international community to come together and find ways to break the age-old deadlocks in the climate sector. This piece of legislation paved the way for state parties to United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, to make commitments to achieve a common goal to reduce greenhouse emissions. So it is interesting to note here what is the basis that leads states or parliaments to assume international legal commitments. And how do they do it? Robert Keohane, he points out a distinction between specific and diffuse reciprocity. So there are two concepts. One is the specific reciprocity in international negotiation and agreement, and the other is diffuse reciprocity. What is specific reciprocity? It allows specified partners to exchange items of equivalent value in a strictly delimited sequence, which generally forms the basis for bilateral agreements. So it is more specific between two parties. But if we go into the diffuse reciprocity, which is slightly wider and which do not ask for a direct or immediate quid pro quo, instead allows parties to engage in somewhat indefinite sequential exchanges within the context of a general pattern of obligation. So in Paris Agreement, it was not specific reciprocity, but it was the diffuse reciprocity, because all the parties and parliaments and whoever were involved in the process came together to protect the common interest. And that this allowed an ongoing series of sequential actions which may continue indefinitely, never balancing but continuing to entail mutual concessions within the context or framework of shared commitment and values. So, when an agreement is reached on the basis of diffuse reciprocity, it is based on shared commitment, values, and common interest. And that is the main thrust of that particular piece of legislation. And that is where the innovation lies, because it moves away from the conventional, traditional, quid pro quo kind of agreement to a much wider arena to bring in the collective interest together and how we can deal with it. Bruno Sima terms it as opposed to bilateralism being the basis of international legal obligations as traditionally seen. International law takes a new turn, developing in a new way recognition of community interest. This leads to an emerging consensus that respect for creating fundamental values is not to be left to the free will of individual states or inter se parties, but must be recognized as a matter of concern to all states. The multilateralism approach takes obligations beyond traditional governmental interaction, but it is always complementary to the governmental interaction. Multilateral lawmaking process can be innovative, and it is based on this approach that allows innovation to take place. This is where parliamentarianism and parliamentary diplomacy becomes relevant. Parliamentary diplomacy can thus be seen as a new tool in the international law and international order to address issues of common interest in an innovative way, because we all gathered here want to build a shared future together, and we want to build a world, a tomorrow which is better. Thank you all for your kind attention.